I want to thank you for joining us today in our continuing study series. I'm Pastor Jerry Burney, and we operate a jail and prison ministry which mails out weekly biblical messages and studies to inmates all over the United States. And once a year, our ministry sends out to every inmate on our mailing list a book, a Christian book. So if you know of someone in jail or prison, please contact us with their name, ID number, and address, and you can contact us through our website, burneyfam.com or targettruthministries.com. Now, we used two books in this series. In today's series, we're exploring a scenario of how the end times, the end of days, might unfold with the return of Christ. And the primary book we're using in this series is this book here, the Book of Chronologies and Time Charts. It contains a lot of time charts of biblical history, and it concludes with a timeline of the end of the world, the end of this age. And it's a unique study, unlike any other. The other book we use is a book called Revelation, Apostasy, End Times, and This Generation. And this book is available through Barnes & Noble, Amazon.com, local bookstores. It's available both in paperback and as an e-book. The Book of Chronologies is available through our website. Our ministry also provides a study series on science, origins, and ancient civilizations based on this book here. And we have another study series on Genesis, the two creation accounts, which uses this book here. So please visit our website, burneyfam.com or Target Truth Ministries, for news, for updates, to access studies and messages, and much, much more. Now, we've gone, I won't go through everything we've gone through recently, but we in the last couple of sessions, we got involved with Ezekiel's 4 prophecy of Israel's return to the country, which was fulfilled exactly in 1948 with the return of the people to Israel, and in 1967 with Jerusalem. That prophecy was fulfilled exactly after 2,520 years. And then we looked at the prophecy of the end times when Israel becomes a country, what's going to happen next, and Jesus tells us that when they become a country, that's when the harvest is near, summer is near. And so we are looking forward to Christ coming back sometime. And of course, during that prophecy, he also said that it would be in the days as in the days of Noah in Matthew 24, which we know lasted for 120 years while Noah was preparing the people for the flood. And then we took a look at the fact of the prophecy being taken to all nations and whether that's going to happen during our time or could happen when the two witnesses are testifying at the temple in the end times, or even when Jesus in the millennium brings the gospel to all nations. So we don't know when that gospel is supposed to be taken to all nations, but it could be any period, including the time right now. And then we took a look at the nations being united against Israel, prophecies of that. And of course, that's right out of Amos 9, said that when the countries are restored, that they would not be dislocated again. So Israel is a country. It's not going to be dislocated again. But there are countries that put it under pressure. And we looked at Ezekiel 36 about how these countries are putting things under pressure. And we know that because they're under pressure that we're looking for a peace agreement today. And people are trying to find that peace agreement today. And then we looked at the idea of the rapture, whether this rapture is going to occur before all the bad events of the end times. And we discussed that. We looked at Revelation 18, verse 23, which tells us that the light of the lamp, the bridegroom, and the bride are still in Babylon in its very last hour of destruction. And then we took a look at Ezekiel 38, Matthew 24, talking about the attack. Right after there's a peace agreement, it doesn't last very long, and the wars begin. And we know that that's just probably exactly what's going to happen. We'll no sooner get a peace agreement than wars are going to break out. And so we read those prophecies of those wars taking place, but we also read the prophecy of the next thing that happens, where God comes along, defeats Gog and Magog, the adversary against Israel, and he does this to elevate himself. Israel is not going to conquer things because of their great military. Neither is the United States. God, in this case, is going to cause the battle to happen and is going to save Israel. And because of that battle ending, there's going to be a peace agreement. And this is the one I believe is described in Daniel 9:27. So let's take a look in Daniel 9:27 and talk about this peace agreement for a second. We see in Daniel 9:27, and this is the prophecy of the 70th week, the 70 weeks of Daniel. The 69th week concluded when Jesus was crucified, and then we had to wait for a period of time to find the 70th week. The 70th week begins unfolding when Israel becomes a country again. And here in verse 27 it says that, and he meaning the Antichrist, the prince who's in charge of the worldly powers at that time, we don't know if it's the United Nations or who it is, but he will make a firm covenant with many nations for a week. He's talking about the many nations having an agreement with Israel for peace. Everybody's always looking for peace. But then it says in the middle of the week, or in the midst of the week, as it's described in the Greek, he will put a stop to the sacrifice and the grain offerings. In other words, they're going to allow Israel to resume their sacrifices and grain offerings, but in the midst of that week, or in the middle of the 7 years, the midst of the 7 years, somewhere in that time frame, they will put a stop to it. And then it says, on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. And of course that's the Antichrist, the one person that we're looking to be exposed someday. When it talks about the wing of abominations there, it's talking about at the pinnacle of abominations, at the height of the abominations. That's what that word wing means in the Greek. And anyway, it says even until a complete destruction, once it's decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So we're going to see that evil one be exposed, and then at the very end he will be put away. So we're going to see a peace agreement that's going to allow Israel to start resuming their sacrifices again. So Israel is going to be protected for a while. Now God tells us that Israel will be protected. We're going to look in Ezekiel 39 first, 8 through 16. And then we'll move into 1 Thessalonians and eventually Revelation 12 verse 6. So the first place we're going to look is Ezekiel 39, 8 to 16. And back up here, Ezekiel 39. And we're going to see that after the war is over, to get this peace agreement going. And Ezekiel 39, verse 8, it says, Behold, it is coming, and it shall be done, declares the Lord God, that the day of which I have spoken, then those who inhabit the cities of Israel will go out and make fires with the weapons and burn them, both shields and bucklers, bows and arrows, war clubs and spears. For 7 years they will make fires of them. In other words, they're going to be able to supply all of their energy needs and everything for 7 years with the weapons that have been taken over because of this war being over. They will not take wood from the field or gather firewood from the forest, for they will make fires with the weapons. And they will take the spoil of those who despoiled them and seize the plunder of those who plundered them, declares the Lord God. And then on verse 11, on that day I will give Gog a burial ground there in Israel. Excuse me. The valley of those who pass by east of the sea, and it will block off those who would pass by. So they will bury Gog there with all his horde. So after the war is over, Israel is going to have access to all their weapons, and they're going to set up a burial ground there and bury the enemy. Verse 12. For 7 months the house of Israel will bury them in order to cleanse the land. Even all the people of the land will bury them. And it will be to their renown on that day that I glorify myself, declares the Lord. Down to verse 16 or verse 14 to 16. They will set apart men who will constantly pass through the land, burying those who were passing through, even those left on the surface of the ground, in order to cleanse it. And at the end of the 7 months, they will make a search. Kind of sounds like a nuclear war, doesn't it? That's what a lot of people think. This is a cleanup procedure after a nuclear war. Verse 15, as those who pass through the land pass through, and anyone sees a man's bone, then he will set up a marker by it until the buriers have buried it in the valley of Hamagog. And even the name of the city will be Hamath, and they will cleanse the land. So they will cleanse the land. So we see here that the battlefield is going to be left untouched for 7 months. 7 months to clean it up by professionals. And for 7 years, they're going to be using the energy, the spoils that are left over from this war. Now let's go up to another passage that tells us about Israel. Now God's won the war, and they're going to be protected. Let's go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 2 and 3. And I'll actually go to verse 1 to give a little context. Here Paul is telling the Thessalonians about the day of the Lord. Chapter 5, verse 1. Now as to the times and the epochs, brethren, you have no need of anything to be written to you. For you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. While they're saying peace and safety, then sudden destruction will come upon them suddenly, like labor pains upon a woman with child, and they will not escape. So peace and safety for now. That's what Israel's going to experience. And then later, like birth pains, all of a sudden will come destruction. There will be interludes of quiet between these birth pains, just like a woman's birth pains. Even before the final period of peace and safety, there'll still be peace and safety, and then destruction. So we're going to see waves of peace and safety and destruction continuing now through the rest of this period of time that we're in. And God defines a period of time for us that Israel is going to be going through in Revelation 12, verse 6. We know it's the last 7 years. And God, and we know that it's in the midst of it that the sacrifices are going to be removed again. So we know that sometime around the midst of it is the middle of it, and God further defines that for us now in Revelation 12. Now Revelation 12, remember that the book of Revelation is not given in any sequence. It's a series of visions, and some of the visions are early and some late. Revelation 12 happens to be a vision from the very beginning of creation all the way to the very end in one chapter. And in verse 6, God says, the woman fled into the wilderness, talking about Israel. Well, she had a place prepared by God so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. 1,260 days is a period of time that Israel is going to be protected by God. And just to put this in context, chapter 12 being a story from the very beginning to the very end, in verses 1 and 2 we see a great sign appearing in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet. Now this is a picture of all the betrothed of God's creation, the woman, pictured in heaven, clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. 12 means complete number. It's all the hosts of heaven are pictured here, the woman. God's always giving a picture of the bride to come, the betrothed. Now we're all betrothed to God. Those who truly love God will become his bride. Those that don't will be divorced. That's the harlot, the ones that leave God. So God always gives this image of a woman here, either the harlot or the bride-to-be. And in this case, in the beginning, everyone's betrothed. We're all in the same place. We're all betrothed to God. And then in verse 2, and she was with child. And of course, this is a picture of the country Israel now, going to bring forth the Messiah. And she cried out, being in labor and pain to give birth. So we know that from the beginning of time, Jesus has been foretold to come from a country, a nation of Israel. And then in verse 3, another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great dragon having 7 heads, 10 horns, and on his head were 7 diadems, or crowns. In other words, we see a picture of Satan now coming along, and he is going to be controlling this world that we live in. And we know that that's true. Even Jesus, when he came to this world, he went, after he got baptized, went into the wilderness, and he was tempted by Satan. Satan offered him control of all the nations of the world if Jesus would just bow and worship Satan. And God said no. So we know that Satan's in control of this world for the time being, and that's what we see here. This other image appeared in heaven, the great red dragon. And then in verse 4, his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven. So we have this picture of the woman with all the stars, a complete number, and now a third of them are swept away by Satan, deceived. Adam and Eve are the example of that. They were swept away by Satan, and so were we. And the dragon stood before the woman. Now, so those that have been swept away now become the nations of this world. One of the nations, Israel, is trying to bring forth the Messiah, the Christ, has to be born of flesh, just like we have to be born of flesh. God tells us in John chapter 3, you must be born of flesh, and then you must be born of spirit in order to be saved. You can't remain as part of the angelic host of heaven to be saved. You have to become flesh in order to die. That's the penalty for sin. And so it says here in verse 4, after he swept away the stars, the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth he might devour the child. And then in verse 5 it says, she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Of course, that's Jesus. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. So Jesus came, and then Jesus died, and he's caught up to the throne of heaven now. And then verse 6 that we just talked about, we fast forward to this end time event where now Israel is going to be protected for 1,260 days. Well, where might Israel be protected? That's always been a question. How's God going to accomplish this? How's he going to protect Israel? And if you look at our slide there, you notice that one of the picture I have there is a picture of Petra. Some people think that Petra is where Egypt, where those that are following God, Israel, true Israel, will flee to for 1,260 days during the end time. One of the interesting things about Petra is that it has a magnetic rock pattern around it that won't allow, airplanes won't allow guided missiles to function properly there. The gyroscopes all go wacky with the magnetic field that surrounds Petra. So you can't send smart bombs in there. You can't send planes with smart bombs in there. They just won't work. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's fun to speculate on these things where Israel might be protected. Anyway, the next thing that comes up is God's going to allow Israel, as they are protected now, to establish their holy place so that they can resume the sacrifices once again. And we can read about this happening in Revelation 11. Revelation 11, we read of a temple. And as we discussed before, this is a temple for the end times. This is not the temple that was destroyed in AD 70. We'll talk about that a little bit in a second. Right now, let's read verses 1 to 6 of Revelation 11, where we're going to see a temple and we're going to see the two witnesses that are going to testify for 1,260 days, 42 months, 3.5 years. 11 verse 1. Then there was given to me a measuring rod like a staff. This is John now. He's witnessing this temple that's in the future. It was given to me a measuring rod like a staff, and someone said, get up and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship in it. It says, leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread it underfoot for 42 months. And I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the two olive trees, the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire flows out of their mouths and devours their enemies. If anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this way. They have the power to shut up the sky so that the rain will not fall during the days of their prophesying. And they have the power over the waters to turn them into blood, and to strike the earth with every plague as often as they desire. So these two witnesses are going to get a lot of attention around the world. This is why I say that maybe this is the prophecy that the gospel will be taken to all nations, because they will have this opportunity to do it like none other. The temple, this temple is during the end times, and Israel doesn't recognize Jesus yet. That's why they want the temple back. as Christians, recognize that Jesus has fulfilled the blood sacrifice. We don't need the temple anymore. And as a matter of fact, each one of us becomes a temple for God to dwell in. I'm going to read in here a section about this, the temple here. I can get over to the page. Revelation 11:1. This is a new temple for the end times. In the Reformation movement, Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Knox, Charles Spurgeon, they all believed the seat of the Pope, the church in Rome, might have been the temple which would be defiled. However, the temple Jesus referred to in Matthew 24 was the temple of the Jews. The outer court of the temple was used for Gentiles, and that existed in 70 A.D., as well as the city of Jerusalem. Now note that the outer court of the temple in 70 A.D. and the city of Jerusalem were not trampled on for 42 months by the nations, as described here. They were not trampled under like that before they were destroyed. And between 67 and 70 A.D., Rome did surround the city, but it did not occupy the city. There's no historical records of two witnesses testifying in the temple for 1,260 days before it was destroyed in 70 A.D., much less their resurrection, which comes later. And so, obviously, things like that would have been noted. So that points out that this temple in Revelation 11 is a new temple. There's no historical record of the events listed in the seals and the trumps having occurred leading up to the temple being destroyed in 70 A.D. So if we read Revelation 6, Revelation 8, and 9, these are all the events that lead up to this temple. We see none of those happening before the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. Therefore, this temple in Revelation 11 must be a new temple, constructed to be in place for the events of the end times. The temple grounds had three courts in it: the court of priests, the court of Israel, which was for the men, and the court for women. And these courts held God's people. He was supposed to count the number of those who worship Christ. There's a specific number which God has predestined to be saved in this age that we live in now. There's even in Isaiah 18, there's even a reference that maybe the Ethiopians would be bringing a gift to the end times temple. And of course we know that there's a lot of people that think that the Ark of the Covenant is held in Ethiopia. So this end times temple is going to be pretty significant, and they're going to resume their sacrifices. In Daniel 8, verses 8 to 14, it states that 2,300 days after the sacrifices are removed, the sanctuary will be cleansed in the end times by Jesus. In other words, there is an end time event when the sanctuary is finally cleansed by Jesus permanently for all time. And this prophecy is said by some to have been fulfilled by Israel in 164 BC, which is celebrated today as Hanukkah. However, there were only 1,080 days between 167 and 164 BC when Jesus fulfilled, or when Hanukkah happened. Jesus fulfilled Hanukkah at Passover. And I actually have a message on Hanukkah, which has been broadcast nationally. So if you'd like to get a copy of that, just get a hold of our website and we'll send you a copy. When Jesus rose from the dead, he fulfilled this prophecy of the 1,080 days, which means Revelation is a future prophecy for the end times, because it's going to be for 2,300 days. Note that the evening and morning sacrifices can be resumed without the temple being built. Ezra chapter 3 tells us that we don't need a temple to resume the evening and morning sacrifices again. So when Israel is given the ability to resume their sacrifices, they don't need to have the tabernacle established. By the way, the tabernacle has already been prepared. It's in Israel right now. And the priests have already been prepared. And all the implements for the worship have already been prepared. They're just waiting for the day that this peace agreement allows them to set it up. The tabernacle could actually be set up in one day. Now in verse 2, the outer court of Revelation 11, the outer court was for the Gentiles, not God's people. The holy city will be under Gentile control for 42 months. Don't bother counting the unrighteous, is what John was told here in Revelation 11. Count only those that are within within the Lord. Now, while the Romans surrounded Jerusalem for 3.5 years before 70 A.D., they did not occupy it. So this has to be a future temple reference. 42 months refers to the end period of the tribulation. And again, you can look at the balloon chart at the back of the time charts, or contact our website. We'll just mail you the balloon chart. The two witnesses will have power to deliver Christ's message for 1,260 days. These two begin their prophecy after the sacrifice is removed. The sackcloth garment is worn to express mourning over the lack of faith and judgment to come, or a penance, a dark color. This could fulfill Matthew 24:14 and Mark 13:10, where the two olive trees and two lampstands, where the olive is representative of the oil and fuel, the Holy Spirit, for light, and the lampstand delivers the light. Possibly Enoch and Elijah, who are the two witnesses, and that's what the speculation is. It's possibly Enoch and Elijah, because these two were taken to heaven without dying. But some say Moses is one of these. The two witnesses represent the political leader, the king in the law, and the religious leader, the priest, the prophet. Zerubbabel and Joshua rebuilt the temple, and Israel will receive ears to hear when they're hearing the two witnesses talk at the temple. The gospel will truly be given to all the nations at this time. Now in verses 5 and 6, when it talks about fire and plagues, these things do remind us of Exodus and Moses and Elijah shutting up the heavens for 3.5 years. So perhaps the two witnesses to testify would be Moses and Elijah, because they will be fulfilling exactly what Moses and Elijah did in the Old Testament. And by the way, we do have a message study on the plagues of the Exodus, which is kind of interesting. So if you'd like to get a copy of that, email us, and we'll email you back. I want to thank you for joining with us today. And if any of you have anybody in prison or jail who would like to receive our messages, please contact our ministry at berniefam.com or targettruthministries.com. We send out weekly messages all over the United States and be glad to add them to our list. God bless.